So before we get to the gospel lesson this morning, I want to start off with something that's a little nearer and dearer to my heart this week. Me. Well, actually my family. I want to give you a rundown, since I wasn't here last week. I want to give you a little rundown on what's happened with us in the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago today, when we got home from church, we found that our little dachshund, Sophie, she's a senior dog, she had managed to push a chair out of the way and knock over our kitchen garbage can. She had done this a few times before, and we thought the chair had solved the problem, but it didn't. So we got home, and everything was spread around. And she was just happily eating her way through everything she found. Sort of like me on Thursday. But other than the mess that she made, when she did that, we didn't think a lot of it. And then Sunday evening, we noticed that her stomach was getting bloated. Not, just like bigger than usual, like you'd expect from eating whatever it was she was eating. But it was bloated. And we had a dog many years ago who suffered from something called a twisted stomach. And that dog passed away from it, so that was kind of in our minds, and we knew there was a problem, so we took her to the emergency room vet. And about 4 hours and $500 later, we brought her home. They did treat her. We brought her home, and they instructed us to see our vet the next day, and we did that, and she's doing okay. That's the short story of that. There's stuff in her that's probably not going to come out, but she's 13, she has congestive heart failure, so the doctor said, really don't worry about it. That was 2 weeks ago. A couple days after that, we realized that our daughter lives with us. Our daughter's cat was ill. And I won't go into details with that because it's early. And you don't want to know. But we took her into the vet. He took one look at her and said, yeah, she's got trouble. And they wanted to try to stabilize her before they did surgery, but by Thursday they decided she wasn't going to make it if they didn't do the surgery, so they did that. So she's had surgery. And she came home last week ago, Friday, and she's been convalescing, wearing the cone of shame. And she's getting back to her old cranky self. And then just this week, on Thanksgiving Eve, we came home and we found that the house was cold and the furnace was dead. I'll spare you the details, but it turns out the furnace, does need to be replaced. It's 20 years old. We've since found out that it's actually a couple of years older than they say furnaces should run, so we got our use out of it. But they can't replace it until Tuesday, so we've been using space heaters. And all of this was going through my head this week as I was preparing the message, and I found that I was thinking a lot more about Job than I was about Luke. But then I started to think a little more. With me thinking it's a slow process. And I remembered earlier last week talking to a woman. She was a client of ours at Hope Council. And she's a middle-aged woman, I would say. And she's living at the Shalom Center right now. She had just gotten in there, like a couple days before. So she's living in a homeless shelter. She's happy. She's happy because for about 3 months before that, she had been living on the street. For 3 months, she'd been sleeping in the park at night, and if the weather was bad, she would sleep in the doorway at the library. And she never really knew where her next meal was coming from. And it hit me that I had a lot of nerve feeling sorry for myself over this streak of bad luck. I had a lot of nerve asking what next when I had a roof over my head and food in the pantry and a little bit of money and family and friends. I had no business feeling sorry for myself. I mentioned family and friends because when we posted about our travails with the furnace, almost immediately we received invitations from people to come and have Thanksgiving with them or to stay with them until the furnace situation was straightened out. And we really appreciated all of that. So I had a lot of nerve asking, what next? When the question really should have been, what did I ever do to deserve the blessings that I've got? I would call that a Thanksgiving fail, at least to start out with. And that brings me to Luke's account of Jesus and the lepers. Jesus and the Lepers, by the way, I think would be a great name for a heavy metal band, if anybody's in that. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're thinking of starting one. So Luke tells us this story about Jesus making his way to Jerusalem. And he's going between Galilee and Samaria, which means he's taking kind of a circuitous route to Jerusalem. He's doing that because he wants to stay off the radar as well as he can. So he comes to this particular place and he encounters a group of 10 lepers. And Luke tells us that they approach, but then they stand off at a distance because back then lepers were expected to stay away from people. So they stood off in the distance, just close enough to be heard, and they yelled out, they cried out to Jesus, and they asked him to heal them. They asked for mercy. They asked to be restored to their place in society. Because in this time and place, remember 2,000 years ago, leprosy was not really understood very well. They knew that if one person had it and they stayed in close proximity to somebody else, that person might contract it as well. So people who suffered from leprosy were considered unclean, which meant you couldn't associate with them or you would become unclean. That would mean you could not participate in the religious rituals of the time, and other people would shun you. So people suffering from leprosy, and that included all sorts of other skin diseases, because you couldn't know for sure which one they were suffering from. Those people were turned out. They were required to live away from society, away from civilization. They were cut off from everything they had ever known by this disease. And the only way to get back into society again, the only way to get back with your family, was to go to the priest and show that you had been healed. You were now clean. If you were really suffering from leprosy, that would never happen, because that disease just doesn't go away on its own. If you were suffering from another skin disease, maybe. But before you could rejoin society, you had to go to the priest and say, hey, look, I'm good. Check me out. It was a disease that took your health, and it took everything you ever knew away from you. So these 10 were desperate. So they heard about Jesus, this healer from Galilee, and they heard that he was coming through, and they appealed to him for mercy. And what did Jesus say? He says, go show yourselves to the priests. And Luke tells us that immediately the lepers left to go do just that. And as they went, as they left, as they headed toward the place where they could show the priests, they looked down and they noticed that they were healed. Just on that word from Jesus, they were cleansed, they were healed, they were made whole again. The Greek word that Luke uses is katharizo. And it does double duty. It means healed from leprosy, and it also means purified or cleansed, as though from an offering. It means being cleansed from a sin by somebody making an offering in exchange for your sins. So just on the word of Jesus to these 10, this miracle happens. And apparently it's pretty quiet. There's no fuss or muss, They just look, and all of a sudden, wow, it's gone. They've been cleansed. They've been restored. Through whatever it was that Jesus did, these 10 lepers are now able to reconnect with society. They are now able to go back to their families and resume the lives that they had had. 10 of them. What does Luke tell us? One of them actually goes back to thank Jesus. One of them is sufficiently grateful to turn back and thank Jesus for getting his life back. And Luke tells us, kind of in a side note, that he was a Samaritan. If you understand society at the time, you can almost hear the sneer in Luke's voice as he writes this. Because in the social context of what everybody knew about Samaritans in those days, Luke was basically saying, and the guy that came back, he was a Samaritan. I mean, can you believe it? How could a Samaritan be this aware when, regular people were not? That's how it was. How is it that a Samaritan would be the one to come back and thank Jesus? Good question. 10 people are restored to health. 10 people are basically given their lives back. And only one of them shows gratitude for it? Seems strange. I was doing a little research on leprosy. It's now called Hansen's disease, by the way. I was doing a little research on this for the last week or so, and it made me wonder, it made me think, I should say, that maybe Jesus would have had better luck with armadillos. I hear laughter. Maybe armadillos would be better than people. Here's a little fun trivia for you. Armadillos are the only mammal other than human beings in which leprosy is normally found. And they think it has to do with the fact of their lower body temperature and the fact that their I'm going to call them hands, their paws tend to be very cool. But for whatever reasons, armadillos are the only other reservoir of the bacterium that causes leprosy. In the U.S., there's about 30 to 50 million nine-banded armadillos. That will come in handy someday on Jeopardy. How many armadillos are there? 30 to 50 million. And out of those 30 to 50 million, just a little bit shy of 5% are believed to harbor leprosy. And among humans in the U.S., that rate is actually about 1 in 2 million. So it's 1,000 times less than armadillos. So just by the sheer weight of numbers, armadillos are probably going to be a lot more grateful than human beings ever would be. But we'll probably never know. I think that says more about us than it does about our little armored friends, though. Maybe it says that human beings as a group are so afflicted with greed that we obsess more over what we don't have than what we do have. Or we worry more about losing what we have. And that's certainly not an uncommon idea. That's almost a stereotype of humanity. But I wonder if maybe human beings in their natural sinful state, remember, we are cut off from God by our sins. And that leaves this God-sized hole in our hearts. And I wonder if part of what we see as greed is really just our desire to fill that gap, to fill that void up. And we try to do it any way we can. It becomes an obsession. It's an obsession born of the idea that we can, on our own, fill that gap in. We don't need God to fill it in. We can do it. We can do it with stuff. We can do it with people. But in reality, the only way to fill that void, the only way to bridge that gap and get back to God comes when we kneel at the feet of the crucified Jesus. The only way to fill that void is to empty ourselves of greed and envy and hate and selfishness, so that we can be filled by the grace of God and the love of God's people. Maybe it's not greed so much as just this desire to be back. And we're just confused about how to do it. In hindsight, it's easy to ding those 9 lepers who never said thank you, but gotta be honest. Suddenly restored to life, a life that you thought was gone forever, or suddenly restored to health, a health that you thought would never be again. With the prospect of suddenly being reconnected with a society that had shunned you, is it at least possible that your first reaction would be to go back and reconnect and to do all those things rather than go back and give thanks for what you've been given? I know for myself, sometimes, and I was reminded this week, sometimes I have to consciously remind myself of how blessed I am. Particularly when the world seems to be doing its best to show me that I'm not. I can hardly point to those 9 and say what a bunch of losers they were. I might have been one of them. Instead, I'll just say that Thanksgiving is an excellent time to take stock. Not of what we have, but of how blessed we are. Not of what we have gained, but of what we have given others. An excellent time to take stock not of what we need, but of who needs help. Not of who we are, but of who God calls us to